September 15th, 2023. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. Jake Morrison and his climbing partner Alex Chen were exploring an off-trail boulder field about 2 miles from the nearest marked hiking path, looking for challenging rock formations that few climbers had attempted. The massive granite boulders in this section of the park created a maze of cracks, crevices, and natural chimneys, a playground for experienced technical climbers. Around 2 p.m., Jake noticed something unusual about a particular crack between two massive boulder formations. The vertical fissure was narrow, maybe 18 to 24 inches at its widest point, and extended deep into the earth between the two rock faces. Most climbers would have passed it without a second glance, too narrow to be interesting for climbing, too deep and dark to be safe for exploration. But something had caught Jake's attention. A flash of color, barely visible in the shadows about 20 feet down into the IB crack. He called Alex over. "You see that?" Jake pointed into the darkness. "Something blue down there. Looks like fabric." Alex shined his headlamp into the crevice, the beam cutting through the gloom and revealing glimpses of something that didn't belong in this natural rock formation. "Could be trash. Hikers sometimes drop stuff in these cracks." But Jake's instincts told him this was different. He secured a rope to a nearby boulder and carefully lowered himself into the narrow opening, his body barely fitting between the dark granite walls. The temperature dropped immediately as he descended, the rock pressing in from both sides. His headlamp beam danced across irregular surfaces, the stone darkened by shadow and protected from direct sunlight for thousands of years. At about 25 feet down, Jake's light illuminated what had caught his attention from above, and what he saw made him freeze completely, his breath catching in his throat. 2 human skeletons, wedged vertically in the narrow crack, one positioned roughly 8 feet above the other. The upper skeleton appeared to be in a climbing position, arms raised above the skull as if reaching upward, desperately trying to escape. The lower skeleton was more compressed, the bones showing signs of impact, as if the person had fallen and been unable to move in the confined space. Both skeletons still wore the remnants of backpacks, one bright blue, one red, remarkably recognizable despite 3 years in the crack. Fragments of clothing clung to some of the bones, deteriorated fabric that had once been hiking attire but was now barely identifiable as textile material. Jake's climbing experience had prepared him for many situations, but not this. His hands shaking, he ascended back to the surface and immediately called 911. Within hours, Rocky Mountain National Park rangers, search and rescue teams, and forensic specialists had descended on the remote boulder field. By evening, as news spread, through law enforcement and search and rescue communities, a grim realization began to take hold. This might be Sarah Thompson and David Miller, the young couple who had vanished without trace on September 12, 2020, exactly 3 years and 3 days earlier. The couple who'd been the subject of one of the most intensive search operations in Colorado history. The couple whose families had spent 3 years not knowing whether they were alive or dead, holding vigils on every anniversary of their disappearance, never giving up hope that someday they'd get answers. 3 years. Sarah and David had been here the entire time, trapped in a vertical crack between massive boulders, invisible from above, impossible to escape from below. Hidden in plain sight, in a park that had been searched by hundreds of volunteers, professional rescuers, helicopters with thermal imaging, and search dogs that had passed within yards of this exact location. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on September 12, 2020, involves a couple deeply in love, a perfect autumn day that turned into tragedy, and a simple misstep that would cost them everything. By the end, you'll understand how Sarah and David ended up trapped in a boulder crack and why it took 3 years to find them. The questions facing investigators were both heartbreaking and complex. How did two experienced hikers end up wedged in a crack that wasn't even on the trail? What had happened during those final hours when they realized they couldn't escape? And could anything have saved them if searchers had looked in the right place? Sarah Marie Thompson was 28 years old in September 2020, a woman whose love for nature and photography had defined her adult life. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with an athletic build maintained through regular hiking, rock climbing, and yoga. Her shoulder-length brown hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail when she was outdoors, and her hazel eyes lit up whenever she talked about her latest photographic project or upcoming adventure. Sarah worked as a freelance photographer in Denver, specializing in landscape and nature photography that she sold through galleries and online platforms. Her work captured the raw beauty of Colorado's wilderness, dramatic mountain peaks at sunrise, intimate details of wildflowers, the play of light through aspen groves. Photography wasn't just her career, it was her passion and her way of connecting with the natural world she loved. She'd grown up in Boulder, Colorado, the daughter of Mark and Jennifer Thompson. Mark was a high school science teacher, Jennifer a nurse at Boulder Community Hospital. They'd raised Sarah and her younger brother Daniel to appreciate nature, spending family weekends hiking, camping, and exploring Colorado's mountains. Sarah's love for the outdoors had been nurtured from childhood, shaped by countless family adventures that had taught her both respect for nature's beauty and awareness of its dangers. Sarah had been an adventurous child who'd grown into a confident, independent woman. She'd graduated from the University of Colorado with a degree in photography and environmental studies, combining her artistic talent with her passion for conservation. Her college thesis project, a photographic study of climate change effects on Colorado's alpine ecosystems, had won awards and been exhibited in Denver galleries. But beneath her professional success and adventurous spirit, Sarah was also someone who valued deep personal connections. She wasn't the type to have dozens of casual acquaintances. Instead, she cultivated a small circle of close friends who appreciated her loyalty, her dry sense of humor, and her genuine interest in their lives. When Sarah cared about someone, she cared completely. David James Miller was 30 years old in September 2020, a software engineer who worked remotely for a tech company based in San Francisco. He stood 6 feet tall with a lean runner's build, dark brown hair he kept short for practical reasons, and brown eyes that reflected his thoughtful, analytical nature. David approached life with the same methodical planning he applied to writing code, researching thoroughly, considering variables, preparing for contingencies. David had grown up in Fort Collins, Colorado, the son of Robert and Linda Miller. Robert owned a small construction company. Linda taught elementary school. They'd raised David and his sister Amy to be responsible, hard-working, and grounded in practical values. David had been the kid who read instruction manuals cover to cover, who planned his Halloween candy strategy with spreadsheet-level detail, who could fix almost anything if you gave him enough time and access to YouTube tutorials. He'd earned a computer science degree from Colorado State University and had immediately been recruited by several major tech companies. He'd chosen a position that allowed remote work so he could stay in Colorado, near the mountains and outdoor activities he loved. David had discovered hiking and backpacking in college, finding that time in nature provided the perfect counterbalance to hours spent in front of computer screens. What made David special to those who knew him was his quiet competence. He wasn't flashy or attention-seeking, but when challenges arose, David was the person who calmly assessed the situation and developed practical solutions. His friends joked that David could survive anywhere because he'd have researched survival techniques, packed the right equipment, and developed a backup plan. Sarah and David had met 4 years earlier, in September 2016, at a photography meetup in Denver focused on landscape photography. David had been trying to improve his photography skills to better document his hiking adventures. Sarah had been there to network with other photographers and scout potential collaboration opportunities. Their first conversation had been about camera lenses, but it had quickly evolved into a discussion about their favorite hiking trails, their shared love for Colorado's wilderness, and their different but complementary approaches to outdoor adventures. Sarah was spontaneous and intuitive, following her instincts and embracing uncertainty. David was methodical and prepared, researching routes and packing for every contingency. They'd balanced each other perfectly. Their first date had been a sunrise hike to Dream Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park, where Sarah had photographed the alpenglow while David made coffee on his portable camp stove. Watching the sun illuminate the peaks while sipping hot coffee together, they'd both felt something significant beginning. The relationship that developed over the following 4 years had been built on shared passions, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. They'd hiked hundreds of miles together throughout Colorado and neighboring states. They'd camped under star-filled skies, climbed 14ers, navigated whitewater rapids, and snowshoed through winter wonderlands. Every adventure had deepened their connection. By 2019, they'd moved in together in a small apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood. The apartment walls were covered with Sarah's photographs, many featuring David silhouetted against dramatic landscapes. Their gear closet overflowed with hiking boots, climbing equipment, camping supplies, and photography equipment organized with David's characteristic attention to detail. In January 2020, David had proposed during a winter camping trip in the Maroon Bells Wilderness. He'd planned it carefully, choosing a location Sarah had photographed many times but had mentioned wanting to visit in winter. On a clear, cold morning with the peaks glowing pink in the sunrise, David had gotten down on one knee in the snow and asked Sarah to marry him. She'd said yes without hesitation, throwing her arms around him and nearly knocking them both over. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever ask," she'd laughed through happy tears. "I've been ready since our third date." They'd planned a simple wedding for October 2021, wanting to wait until fall when Colorado's aspens would be golden. Sarah had been excited about the photography opportunities. She'd joked about making David pose for engagement photos on every hike between proposal and wedding. Their families had been thrilled, having watched the relationship develop and recognized how well-suited Sarah and David were for each other. Sarah's parents, Mark and Jennifer, had welcomed David into their family immediately. Mark appreciated David's thoughtful nature and the way he clearly treasured their daughter. Jennifer loved how David supported Sarah's career and encouraged her adventures rather than trying to make her more conventional or cautious. David's parents, Robert and Linda, had been equally enthusiastic about Sarah. Robert admired her independence and adventurous spirit. Linda was delighted that David had found someone who shared his love for the outdoors and brought spontaneity and joy to his sometimes overly planned life. The wedding planning had been characteristically balanced, Sarah handling the creative and aesthetic elements, David managing the logistics and budget. They'd been looking at venues in the mountains, discussing whether to have a traditional ceremony or something more unconventional that reflected their personalities. The wedding was still 13 months away when they'd planned their fateful hike in September 2020. What made Sarah and David's relationship special to those who knew them was how completely they complemented each other. Sarah pushed David to be more spontaneous and embrace uncertainty. David helped Sarah think through risks and prepare for contingencies. Together, they'd been adventurous but not reckless, spontaneous but not careless. Both were experienced hikers who understood mountain safety. They always told someone where they were going and when they'd return. They packed appropriate gear for weather changes. They stayed on marked trails unless they had specific knowledge of off-trail areas. They'd successfully completed dozens of challenging hikes without incident, building confidence in their abilities while maintaining respect for nature's unpredictability. September 12, 2020, was supposed to be another perfect day in the mountains. A relatively easy 8-mile loop trail they'd hiked before, good weather forecast, and plans to be back in Denver by dinner. Instead, it would be the day that Sarah and David's adventure ended in tragedy, the day their families' lives changed forever, the beginning of a mystery that would haunt everyone who loved them for the next 3 years. Saturday, September 12, 2020. Denver had awakened to a perfect autumn morning. Temperature in the mid-50s, clear blue skies, weather forecast calling for highs in the low 70s with no chance of precipitation. It was the kind of Colorado day that made people fall in love with the state, crisp and clear with golden light that photographers dream about. Sarah and David had set their alarm for 5 a.m., planning to get an early start to avoid crowds and maximize their time in the mountains. Sarah had been excited about the photography opportunities. Early September brought the first hints of fall color to the high country, and she'd been eager to capture the transition from summer green to autumn gold. They'd packed the night before with their usual careful preparation. David had checked weather forecasts, mapped their route, charged their phones and portable battery packs, and confirmed they had all necessary gear. Sarah had organized her camera equipment, packed extra memory cards and batteries, and chosen lenses based on the type of landscapes she hoped to photograph. They'd left their apartment around 6 a.m. in David's Subaru Outback, stopping at Starbucks for large coffees and breakfast sandwiches to eat on the drive. The hour-and-a-half journey to Rocky Mountain National Park had been filled with comfortable conversation, and Sarah's excited planning of photo compositions she wanted to attempt. The light should be perfect around 9, Sarah had said, reviewing weather and sunrise data on her phone. Golden hour might extend longer at this elevation. I want to get that shot of Bear Lake with the peaks reflected in the water. We should have plenty of time, David had replied, glancing at his carefully planned itinerary. If we start hiking by 8:30, we'll hit Bear Lake around 9:15. Perfect timing. You and your schedules, Sarah had teased, squeezing his hand affectionately. What would happen if we just wandered without a plan? The universe would implode, David had answered with a grin. Besides, someone needs to make sure we're back in time for dinner. Your mom's making that lasagna you love, remember? They'd arrived at the trailhead parking area around 8:20 a.m., finding it already half full with other hikers taking advantage of the beautiful weather. David had backed into a parking space, a habit from his father, who'd always insisted that backing in made leaving safer and easier, and they'd spent a few minutes organizing their packs. Sarah's bright red backpack contained her camera equipment, extra layers, snacks, and 2 liters of water. David's blue pack held their first aid kit, navigation tools, emergency supplies, food, and 3 liters of water. They'd both worn layers appropriate for variable mountain weather, Sarah in dark jeans and a light blue denim shirt over a tank top, David in cargo shorts and a blue plaid shirt over a technical t-shirt. Before heading to the trail, they'd taken a selfie at the trailhead sign, a tradition they maintained on every hike. The photo captured them smiling broadly, Sarah's arm around David's waist. David's arm draped over her shoulders. Behind them, the valley stretched out in perfect clarity. Dense pine forests giving way to rocky peaks under brilliant blue skies. The image radiated joy, optimism, and the promise of a beautiful day ahead. Sarah had posted the photo to Instagram at 8:27 a.m. with the caption, "Perfect day for adventures with my favorite person. Bear Lake Loop, here we come." The post would receive dozens of likes and comments throughout the day, friends responding with enthusiasm, never imagining it would be the last photo anyone would see of Sarah and David alive. They'd started hiking at 8:32 a.m. David had checked his watch and noted it in the small notebook he always carried, a habit Sarah found both amusing and endearing. The trail had been busy with other hikers, mostly families and couples enjoying the weekend. Sarah and David had moved at a comfortable pace, stopping periodically for Sarah to photograph interesting details: wildflowers, rock formations, the play of morning light through the pines. Around 9:15, they'd reached Bear Lake, finding the shoreline crowded with other hikers and photographers. Sarah had been slightly disappointed by the crowds, but had found a quiet spot to set up her tripod and capture the reflection she'd envisioned. David had sat nearby on a boulder, eating trail mix, and checking their progress against his planned timeline. At 10:32 a.m., Sarah had sent a text message to her mother. "Amazing views! Getting beautiful photos. Love you." The message would be the last communication anyone received from either Sarah or David. Around 10:45, according to reconstruction by investigators based on their planned route and the location where they'd later be found, Sarah and David had left the main trail. The reason for this deviation would never be completely certain, but the most likely explanation was that Sarah had spotted something photographically interesting off-trail, perhaps unusual rock formations, a particularly beautiful vista, or wildlife that she'd wanted to capture. This wouldn't have been unusual or particularly risky. Sarah and David occasionally ventured short distances off-trail when Sarah saw photographic opportunities, always staying within sight of the marked path and being careful not to damage sensitive vegetation. They'd done it dozens of times on previous hikes without incident. But this time, they'd ventured into an area of complex boulder fields where massive granite formations created a maze of gaps, cracks, and unstable spaces between rocks. The boulders in this area, some as large as cars or small houses, had been deposited by ancient glaciers and had settled in precarious configurations over thousands of years. Sometime around 11 a.m., the best reconstruction suggested, Sarah had been moving between boulders when the ground beneath her had given way. What had appeared to be solid ground was actually a thin layer of soil and small rocks covering a narrow vertical crack between two massive boulder formations. Sarah had fallen through the surface, dropping into the crack. The opening at the top was perhaps 2 feet wide, but the crack narrowed as it descended, funneling her body downward between moss-covered rock walls. She'd fallen approximately 15 to 20 feet before becoming wedged in the narrow space, unable to move up or down, her body compressed by rock on both sides. David, hiking close behind Sarah, had seen her disappear through what had looked like solid ground. He'd immediately rushed to the opening and called down to her, his voice echoing in the confined space. Evidence found later suggested David had tried multiple approaches to rescue Sarah. He'd called 911, but cell service in that specific location was non-existent. A dead zone in the mountains, where signals couldn't reach towers. He'd tried to pull Sarah up, but she was wedged too tightly and too far down for him to reach her hands. Faced with an impossible choice, leave Sarah alone and trapped while he ran for help, which could take an hour or more given their off-trail location, or attempt to descend into the crack to provide direct assistance. David had made the decision that countless loving partners would make. He'd chosen to go down to her. David had removed his backpack and lowered it into the crack first, then carefully descended into the narrow opening. The crack was barely wide enough for his body, the rock walls scraping his shoulders and hips as he maneuvered downward. He'd probably intended to reach Sarah, assess her condition, perhaps help her wiggle free from where she was stuck. But what David hadn't understood, what he couldn't have known, was that this type of crack acted like a funnel. It was relatively wide near the top but narrowed progressively as it descended. Once he'd descended past a certain point, the rock walls pressed in from both sides, making it impossible to move back up. Like Sarah below him, David had become wedged in the crack, unable to ascend or descend, trapped by geology and physics. When Sarah and David didn't return to the trailhead by their planned 4 p.m. return time, no one was immediately alarmed. Hikers sometimes took longer than expected, got delayed by photo opportunities, or decided to extend their hike to enjoy perfect weather. But by 6 p.m., when the parking lot emptied and David's Subaru remained alone with no sign of the couple, concern began to mount. At 6:15 p.m., a park ranger noticed the Subaru in the otherwise empty lot. Running the plates and finding the vehicle registered to David Miller, the ranger called the number listed in park records, David's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. The ranger left a message asking David to contact the ranger station when he received it. By 7 p.m., with sunset approaching and still no sign of Sarah and David, the ranger initiated Check the Welfare protocols. He contacted both their emergency contact numbers, Sarah's parents in Boulder and David's parents in Fort Collins. Neither family had heard from the couple since morning. Mark Thompson, Sarah's father, had been the first to express serious concern. "Sarah always calls when she's running late," he'd told the ranger. "Always. Even just a quick text. It's not like her to not communicate." Robert Miller, David's father, had echoed that concern. "David is meticulous about timelines. If he says 4 p.m., he means 4 p.m., unless something has prevented him from getting back. You need to start looking for them now." By 7:30 p.m., Rocky Mountain National Park search and rescue had been activated. Initial response teams hiked the Bear Lake Loop Trail with high-powered flashlights, calling Sarah and David's names, looking for any sign of the couple or indication of where they might have left the trail. They found nothing. The search expanded dramatically at first light on Sunday morning. Over 100 volunteers joined park rangers and professional search and rescue teams in combing the area around the Bear Lake Loop Trail. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the search area, looking for heat signatures that might indicate people in distress. Search dogs trained to find human scent worked the trails and surrounding areas. Sarah's parents, Mark and Jennifer, had driven up from Boulder that Sunday morning, joining David's parents, Robert and Linda, at the command post that had been established near the trailhead. The four parents sat together in shocked disbelief, trying to comprehend how their experienced, careful children could simply vanish on a well-traveled trail in good weather. "They know what they're doing out here," Mark had said repeatedly, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "Sarah's been hiking these mountains since she was 6 years old. She knows better than to take unnecessary risks." "David always has a plan," Robert had added, "always prepared for contingencies. He wouldn't have gone anywhere dangerous without proper equipment." But as Sunday turned to Monday, then Tuesday, with no sign of Sarah and David despite hundreds of searchers covering every inch of the trail system and surrounding areas, a terrible reality began to settle over their families. Something had happened. something that had prevented two experienced hikers from either getting back to their car or calling for help. The search operation became one of the largest in Colorado history, with volunteers coming from across the state to help. Sarah's photography community rallied, organizing search parties of people who knew her favorite locations and artistic eye. David's co-workers from the tech company formed teams, many traveling from California to join the search. Daniel Thompson, Sarah's younger brother, took a leave of absence from his job in Chicago and spent 2 weeks in Colorado coordinating volunteer search efforts. Amy Miller, David's sister, did the same, creating spreadsheets to track which areas had been searched and organizing social media campaigns to keep attention on the case. The boulder field where Sarah and David had actually fallen was searched multiple times by different teams, but the crack that had swallowed them was nearly invisible from above, just a dark shadow between massive boulders that searchers assumed was shallow or ended in solid rock a few feet down. No one had thought to descend into that particular crack because it looked too narrow to accommodate a human body. The search dogs had passed within yards of the crack on multiple occasions, but the narrow opening and depth meant that very little scent escaped to the surface, particularly after the first few days when Sarah and David were no longer moving or calling out. The thermal imaging cameras on helicopters couldn't detect heat signatures deep inside rock formations where the stone itself blocked infrared radiation. After 3 weeks of intensive searching without finding any trace of Sarah or David, no clothing, no equipment, no footprints leading away from the trail, the search was officially scaled back to occasional systematic sweeps by volunteers and periodic aerial surveys. The case remained open, but the massive daily search operations ended. Sarah's family refused to accept that she and David might never be found. Mark and Jennifer Thompson organized quarterly search parties, recruiting volunteers to systematically cover areas that might have been missed during the initial search. They created a website dedicated to finding Sarah and David, sharing photos and information in hopes that someone might have seen something useful. David's family did the same, with Robert Miller using his construction company resources to fund aerial searches and hire private investigators to review the case from fresh perspectives. But despite their efforts, months passed without any new leads or discoveries. The grief of not knowing was excruciating for both families. Were Sarah and David dead, or somehow alive and unable to communicate? Had they been injured and died slowly, or had something quick and painless taken them? Were they together when it happened, or had they been separated? The questions haunted every family member, making it impossible to properly mourn or find closure. Sarah's bedroom in her parents' house remained exactly as she'd left it, her photography equipment still organized on shelves, prints of her best work covering the walls. Jennifer couldn't bring herself to change anything, holding on to the irrational hope that Sarah might somehow come home and want to find her room untouched. David's apartment lease had expired 6 months after his disappearance. His parents had carefully packed his belongings, storing everything in their garage rather than donating or disposing of items that represented their son's life. Robert organized the boxes with the same methodical attention to detail that David had always shown, as if maintaining that order might somehow bring his son back. The first anniversary of the disappearance, September 12, 2021, brought renewed attention to the case. Both families organized a vigil at the trailhead where Sarah and David had begun their hike. Over 200 people attended, holding candles and sharing memories of the couple who'd vanished. The second anniversary, in 2022, saw a smaller gathering but no less intense grief. By this point, most people had accepted that Sarah and David were almost certainly dead. though their bodies might never be recovered. The mountains kept many secrets, and some people who went missing in wilderness areas were simply never found. But Sarah and David's families never stopped hoping. They continued organizing search parties, maintaining social media presence, and keeping the case active in public consciousness. They refused to let Sarah and David become just another statistic, another unsolved missing persons case that eventually faded from memory. The 3 years between Sarah and David's disappearance in September 2020 and the discovery of their remains in September 2023 were defined by unbearable uncertainty for their families. The COVID-19 pandemic that dominated much of 2020 and 2021 had added additional layers of difficulty to ongoing search efforts, with restrictions on group gatherings complicating volunteer search parties. Both families had to navigate grief without closure, unable to hold funerals or truly accept that Sarah and David were gone. The wedding that should have happened in October 2021 never occurred, though Sarah's mother had kept the venue reservation for months, unable to cancel something that felt like giving up hope. Mark Thompson had retired early from teaching, unable to focus on his students while his daughter remained missing. He'd spent countless hours hiking the trails around Bear Lake, often alone, looking for any sign that searchers might have missed. Sometimes Jennifer joined him, the two of them walking in silence, each lost in their own grief and memories. Daniel Thompson had returned to Chicago, but flew back to Colorado every few months to join search parties his parents organized. The guilt of living his life while his sister remained missing ate at him constantly. He'd been planning to be in Sarah's wedding, to give a toast about how happy he was that she'd found someone like David. Instead, he'd spent 3 years searching boulder fields and canyon bottoms. David's parents had struggled similarly. Linda Miller had stopped sleeping through the night, waking at 2 or 3 a.m. to review maps and search logs, convinced there must be some area that hadn't been properly covered. Robert had used his construction expertise to analyze the terrain, developing theories about where 2 people might have ended up if they'd fallen or gotten lost. Amy Miller, David's sister, had created a detailed database of every search operation, every area covered, every piece of evidence or potential lead. She'd interviewed search and rescue professionals about gaps in coverage, studied maps until she could visualize the terrain in her sleep. Her husband and children had watched helplessly as Amy's search for her brother consumed more and more of her life. The couple's friends had been devastated as well. The photography community that Sarah had been part of organized annual fundraisers for search and rescue organizations, turning their grief into action. David's co-workers had created a scholarship fund in his name for students pursuing computer science degrees, wanting to honor his memory even as they hoped he might somehow still return. The engaged couple's apartment had been difficult for both families to deal with. Neither set of parents could bring themselves to pack up the life Sarah and David had built together. The photographs on the walls, the gear organized in the closet, the wedding planning materials spread across their desk. Eventually, they'd boxed everything carefully and split the belongings between the 2 families, each keeping pieces of the couple's shared life. The question of whether to have Sarah and David declared legally dead had been agonizing. Colorado law required 7 years before missing persons could be declared dead without a body or specific evidence of death. Some family members felt the declaration would provide closure and allow them to move forward. Others felt it was giving up, abandoning hope that Sarah and David might somehow still be alive. As the 3rd anniversary approached in September 2023, both families had planned another vigil at the trailhead. The gatherings had gotten smaller, each year as public attention faded and people moved on with their lives. But for Sarah and David's families, time hadn't dulled the pain or the desperate need to know what had happened. September 15th, 2023. 3 years and 3 days after Sarah and David had vanished. Jake Morrison and Alex Chen were experienced rock climbers who'd been exploring Rocky Mountain National Park's more challenging and less traveled areas for years. They'd specifically sought out the Boulder field near the Bear Lake Trail because they'd heard it contained some interesting crack climbing opportunities. The Boulder field consisted of massive granite formations, some over 30 feet tall, deposited by ancient glaciers. The spaces between boulders created a complex three-dimensional maze. Some gaps were wide enough to walk through. Others were narrow chimneys that technical climbers could ascend. And some were simply dark voids between rock faces that seemed to go nowhere. Jake and Alex had been systematically exploring different cracks, assessing which ones might be worth attempting as climbing routes. Around 2 p.m., Jake had been examining a particularly narrow vertical crack between two house-sized boulders when he'd noticed something unusual. A flash of bright color deep in the shadows, where there should have been only darkness and stone. "Alex, come look at this," he'd called to his partner. "There's something down in this crack. Looks like fabric, maybe trash." Alex had joined him, and together they'd shined headlamps into the narrow opening. The crack was roughly 18 to 24 inches wide at the top, narrowing as it descended between the two massive boulder faces. The rock walls were dark with moisture and covered with moss and lichens, creating an almost claustrophobic appearance even from above. About 20 feet down, illuminated by their headlamp beams, they could see what had caught Jake's attention. Something bright blue, fabric-like, that definitely didn't belong in this natural formation. "I'm going down for a closer look," Jake had decided, already preparing his rope and harness. "Probably just some trash that blew in here, but we should document it for the Park Service." Alex had secured the rope around a stable boulder, and Jake had carefully lowered himself into the crack. The descent was immediately claustrophobic. The rock walls pressed in from both sides, rough stone scraping against his shoulders. The temperature dropped noticeably as he went deeper, and the air became damp and musty. At about 15 feet down, Jake's headlamp had illuminated something that made his breath catch. Not trash. A backpack. A bright blue backpack still strapped to what appeared to be a human skeleton positioned vertically in the crack, arms raised above the skull as if the person had been trying to climb upward. Jake's mind had raced, trying to process what he was seeing. The skeleton was wedged tightly between the rock walls, which explained why the person hadn't fallen further. Fragments of deteriorated fabric clung to some of the bones, barely recognizable as clothing after 3 years in the crack. "Oh my God," Jake had whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Then louder, calling up to Alex, "It's a body! There's a body down here!" "What?" Alex's voice drifted down from above. "Are you sure?" "Positive. It's skeletal. Been here a while. There's—" Jake's headlamp beam had swept lower, revealing something even more disturbing. About 8 feet below the first skeleton, wedged in the narrower section of the crack, was a second skeleton. A bright red backpack was still strapped to these remains. "There are 2 bodies," Jake had called up, his voice shaking. "2 people, both wedged in the crack. Alex, I think these might be those hikers who disappeared. Sarah and David, the couple everyone was searching for." Jake had taken photographs with his phone, documenting the scene before ascending. His hands had been shaking so badly it had taken him 2 tries to clip back into the rope. The climb back to the surface had seemed to take forever, the weight of what he'd discovered pressing on him even as the physical pressure of the rock walls eased. Back at the surface, Jake had immediately called 911. The dispatcher, hearing two bodies in a crack in the boulder field near Bear Lake Trail, had immediately connected him to park rangers and search and rescue coordination. Within 30 minutes, the first rangers had arrived. Within an hour, a full recovery operation was being organized. And within 2 hours, as word spread through the search and rescue community, the terrible realization had taken hold. After 3 years, Sarah Thompson and David Miller had been found. The recovery operation took 3 days of careful, painstaking work. The crack was too narrow for most people to descend safely, and the deteriorated condition of the remains meant everything had to be handled with extreme care. Technical rope teams had to widen the crack slightly, using careful, minimal force to avoid damaging the remains or causing further rockfall. The first body recovered, the upper skeleton, was determined to be David Miller based on skeletal measurements consistent with his known height and build, dental records, and personal effects found with the remains. His wallet, though severely deteriorated, was still present with his driver's license damaged, but readable enough for preliminary identification. His cell phone was also recovered, completely non-functional and water-damaged. The second body, recovered the following day, was confirmed to be Sarah Thompson. Her distinctive red backpack provided initial identification, confirmed by dental records and a silver bracelet still on her wrist bone. A bracelet her parents recognized immediately from photographs. Her camera, carefully protected in a waterproof case in her backpack, was recovered, intact. When forensic technicians later managed to extract the memory card, the last photos showed the beautiful mountain landscape from just before the accident. The position of the bodies told a heartbreaking story. Sarah was wedged in the narrower lower section of the crack, her body compressed by rock walls that had allowed her to fall to that point, but prevented her from going further. Her arms were positioned close to her body, limited in movement by the confined space. David was positioned about 8 feet above Sarah, wedged in a section of the crack that was slightly wider but still far too narrow to allow escape. His skeletal arms were raised above his skull, the bones positioned in a way that suggested he'd been trying desperately to climb upward, to escape, perhaps to reach the surface and get help for Sarah. Forensic analysis later determined that both had died from exposure and dehydration over a period of 3 to 5 days. The crack's depth and narrow opening meant that daytime temperatures remained cool even in September, but nighttime temperatures would have dropped into the 40s. Without the ability to move, keep warm, or access water, hypothermia and dehydration had killed them both. David's severely damaged cell phone was sent to a specialized forensic data recovery laboratory in Denver. After 2 weeks of painstaking work, technicians managed to extract data from the device's internal memory chip, bypassing the damaged screen and corroded circuits. The recovered data painted a devastating picture of their final days. The phone showed multiple attempts to call 911, over 30 attempts spread across the first 2 days, every single one failing due to lack of cell service in that specific location. The phone's battery had lasted approximately 48 hours before dying. Most heartbreaking was a final photograph recovered from the phone's memory, taken on what must have been their first day in the crack. The image showed Sarah below him, looking up toward the camera, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but still clearly recognizable. David must have been trying to document their situation, perhaps hoping the photo might help rescuers find them if he could somehow get a signal. The metadata showed the photo was taken at 3:47 p.m. on September 12, 2020, approximately 4 to 5 hours after they'd fallen into the crack. Sarah's camera contained photos from the morning of their hike, beautiful landscapes, wildlife, the reflection shots at Bear Lake she'd been so excited to capture. The final photo was of the boulder field itself, apparently the thing that had caught her photographic eye and lured them off the trail. It was a stunning composition, the massive rocks creating dramatic shapes and shadows. It was also the last thing she'd photographed before falling through the deceptively thin ground cover. The news that Sarah Thompson and David Miller had been found, 3 years after their disappearance, devastated their families in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. They'd spent 3 years hoping for answers, while simultaneously dreading what those answers might reveal. Learning that Sarah and David had died slowly over several days, trapped and unable to escape, knowing that search teams had passed within yards of their location multiple times, was almost unbearable. Mark and Jennifer Thompson received the call from park rangers on September 16, 2023. Mark later described the phone conversation as the worst moment of his life. Worse even than the original call saying Sarah was missing, because at least then there had been hope. "We found them," the ranger had said gently. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. We found Sarah and David." The forensic analysis revealed details that were both heartbreaking and crucial for understanding what had happened. The crack between the boulders had been created by the specific way the massive rocks had settled over thousands of years. The opening at the top was deceptive. It looked like solid ground covered with soil and small rocks, but beneath was a narrow vertical shaft extending down 40 feet between the two boulder faces. Sarah had fallen through the thin ground cover, dropping approximately 15 to 20 feet before becoming wedged in the narrowing crack. The fall itself had probably resulted in injuries based on stress marks visible on the skeletal remains, but nothing immediately fatal. She'd been trapped, unable to move up or down, but alive and conscious. David, seeing Sarah fall and hearing her cries for help, had done what investigators believed any loving partner would do. He'd tried to help. He'd attempted to pull her out from above, but she was too far down and wedged too tightly. He'd tried calling for help, but they were in a cell service dead zone. So he'd made the decision to descend into the crack, probably hoping he could reach her, assess her injuries, and help her wiggle free. But the crack's configuration had been a fatal trap. The walls narrowed progressively as they descended, and once David had descended past a certain point, he couldn't climb back up. His body pressed too tightly by rock on both sides, with no handholds or footholds to support upward movement. He'd become wedged just like Sarah, trapped about 8 feet above her. Forensic experts estimated that both had survived for approximately 3 to 5 days, based on typical survival times for exposure and dehydration in similar circumstances, the environmental conditions within the crack, and analysis of the remains' positioning which suggested prolonged immobility before death. The cool temperatures in the deep crack would have slowed dehydration slightly, but also contributed to hypothermia during the cold September nights. Unable to move, conserve body heat, or access water, they'd gradually succumbed to exposure. The preservation of the skeletal remains over 3 years was due to several factors. The crack's depth and narrow opening protected the bodies from scavengers that couldn't access the confined space. The dry Colorado climate, combined with the crack's protection from direct precipitation and the lack of standing water at that depth, had prevented the rapid decomposition that would occur in more humid environments. The stable, cool temperature deep in the crack had slowed bacterial activity. While soft tissues had decomposed over the 3 years, the skeletal structure remained intact and well preserved, protected from the elements and animal activity that typically scatter and damage exposed remains. The most devastating revelation for the families was learning how close search teams had come to finding them. The boulder field had been searched multiple times during the initial intensive search operation. Search dogs had passed within 15 yards of the crack opening. Searchers had walked around the very boulders that held Sarah and David. But the crack opening was nearly invisible from above, just a dark shadow between massive rocks that searchers had assumed was either shallow or ended in solid rock a few feet down. No one had thought to descend into it because it looked too narrow to accommodate human bodies. And by the time search teams had reached the area, probably 3 or 4 days after the accident, Sarah and David were likely already dead or too weak to call out loudly enough to be heard from the crack's depths. The families had to grapple with the knowledge that if just one searcher had thought to check that particular crack, had descended with a rope just to be thorough, Sarah and David might have been rescued alive during those first crucial days. It was a realization that brought fresh grief layered on top of existing pain. The funeral was held on October 7, 2023, exactly 3 years, 3 weeks, and 4 days after Sarah and David had started their final hike together. It should have been their second wedding anniversary. Instead, it was the day their families finally got to say goodbye. The service was held at a church in Boulder, with views of the mountains that Sarah had loved to photograph. Over 500 people attended: family, friends, Sarah's photography community, David's co-workers, search and rescue volunteers who'd spent weeks looking for them, and strangers who'd followed the story and wanted to pay respects. Sarah and David were buried together in a single grave, their ashes combined as their families felt the couple would have wanted. The gravestone read, "Sarah Thompson and David Miller, together in adventure, together forever. September 12, 2020. At the funeral, Daniel Thompson spoke about his sister. "Sarah lived exactly the way she wanted to," he said, his voice breaking. "She was passionate about photography, about nature, about adventure. She found someone who shared those passions and loved her completely. She died doing something she loved, with the person she loved. There's something beautiful in that, even though the loss is unbearable." Amy Miller spoke about her brother. "David's last act was trying to save the woman he loved," she said through tears. "He could have run for help. He could have saved himself. But that wasn't who David was. He went down into that crack knowing it was dangerous because Sarah needed him. That's the kind of person he was. Loyal, brave, loving. I'm devastated that he's gone, but I'm proud of who he was until the very end." The tragedy prompted changes in Rocky Mountain National Park's search protocols and trail safety measures. Warning signs were installed near the boulder field, advising hikers to stay on marked trails and warning about hidden crevices and cracks beneath seemingly solid ground. Search and rescue teams updated their procedures to include more thorough examination of boulder cracks and similar geological features. The families established the Sarah Thompson and David Miller Memorial Fund, supporting search and rescue operations, wilderness safety education, and photography scholarships for students interested in nature photography. They wanted something positive to come from the tragedy, some way to honor Sarah and David's love for the outdoors while helping prevent similar tragedies. For the families, the discovery brought a complicated mix of emotions. There was relief in finally having answers, in finally being able to properly mourn and say goodbye. There was devastating grief in learning exactly how Sarah and David had died. There was anger at the cruel randomness of a thin patch of ground giving way at exactly the wrong moment. There was guilt about every imagined scenario they'd created during 3 years of not knowing, many of which had been worse than the reality. But there was also, eventually, a form of peace, Sarah and David had been together when they died. David's last act had been attempting to save the woman he loved. Sarah hadn't been alone in her final days. David had been there, just feet above her, talking to her, probably trying to keep her spirits up and keep himself awake and alert. The investigation found evidence that David had been talking to Sarah throughout their ordeal. Slight wear patterns on the rock near David's position suggested he'd been moving his head and neck as much as the confined space allowed, probably calling down to Sarah, trying to keep both of them engaged and hopeful despite their desperate situation. His phone records showed that between failed 911 attempts, he'd sometimes waited hours, perhaps talking to Sarah, perhaps conserving battery life, hoping for a signal that never came. The final photograph on David's phone, Sarah looking up at him from below, had been sent to both families after they'd requested it. It was heartbreaking to see, but it also showed them something important. Sarah's face in that photo, while tear-streaked and frightened, also showed determination. She hadn't given up. She'd been fighting to survive, believing they'd find a way out or that help would come. Mark Thompson had that photograph enlarged and framed in his home, despite how painful it was to look at. She was scared, but not defeated, he explained to a friend who'd questioned why he'd want such a tragic image displayed. That's my Sarah. Even in the worst moment of her life, she was still fighting. I need to remember her that way, not as a victim, but as someone who fought until the very end. The story of Sarah Thompson and David Miller served as a sobering reminder about nature's unpredictability and hidden dangers. They'd been experienced hikers who'd taken reasonable precautions. They'd told people where they were going. They'd packed appropriate gear. They'd hiked trails they'd done before. But one moment of bad luck, stepping on ground that looked solid but wasn't, had been enough to end both their lives. The tragedy also highlighted the limitations of even intensive search operations. Despite hundreds of searchers, helicopters with thermal imaging, search dogs, and weeks of systematic coverage, Sarah and David had remained undiscovered for 3 years. They'd been within yards of searchers, but hidden in a geological feature that looked insignificant from above. It was a humbling reminder that wilderness areas could keep their secrets, that not every missing person would be found quickly or easily. For Jake Morrison, the climber who'd discovered the remains, the experience had been traumatic. He'd gone rock climbing and found himself descending into what was essentially a tomb, encountering skeletal remains of 2 people who'd died slowly and desperately. He'd struggled with nightmares and intrusive thoughts, eventually seeking therapy to process what he'd witnessed. But Jake had also provided an invaluable service to Sarah and David's families. Without his curiosity about that flash of color in the crack, without his decision to descend and investigate, Sarah and David might never have been found. The families had reached out to thank Jake, expressing gratitude that their loved ones hadn't remained lost forever, that they'd finally been able to bring Sarah and David home. 3 years after Sarah and David had vanished on a beautiful September day, their story finally had an ending. It wasn't the ending anyone had hoped for during those 3 years of searching and wondering. It was tragic, heartbreaking, and raised painful questions about how close they'd come to being rescued. But it was also, in its way, a story about love, about David's willingness to risk everything to help Sarah, about families who'd never stopped searching, about communities that had rallied to try to find 2 young people who'd disappeared. And it was a reminder to cherish the people we love, to take nothing for granted, and to understand that every adventure carries risks that can't always be predicted or prevented. Rest in peace. Sarah Thompson and David Miller. Your adventure ended far too soon, but you faced it together. The way you'd planned to face everything life brought you. You're home now, no longer trapped in darkness, finally free.